All right, today's class is going to be a little bit different. We are going to talk about the origin of false gods. Okay? So, let's start with, where do false gods come from?
Humans.
Okay,
Humans
so
wanting something to worship that they can control.
from man. Okay, we'll get down here into the why. To have control. Okay. What else? Why do people make false gods?
To make sense of the universe.
Okay. To make sense of the universe. Why else?
To make a richer culture.
To make a who?
Richer culture.
Okay, richer culture. Okay. Why? We talked about why they make false gods. What do you get from false gods?
Nothing.
Okay. I like that answer. We get nothing. Okay. What else though?
Depending on the false god, we can appear better or smarter to other people.
Okay. So let's call that
Appearance.
credibility. Okay. What else?
Well, you get everything under the line.
Everything under the why. Good job. You're making the connection now. We make this so that we can have these things. The why I created it was to get something. Okay? Now, let me ask you this question. God, the one true God described in the Bible. What's his name?
There are lots of names for
There are lots of names for him. Okay. Give me an example. Let's go over here. Names of God.
I am.
Okay. That's how he describes himself, right? But what about what people call him? So I will give you, yes, I am is what he calls himself. What do people call him?
Yahweh.
Yahweh. Okay. Let's go over here.
Jehovah.
Jehovah, which is just the vowels of Yahweh with consonants added to it. Okay. Okay.
Lord.
Lord. Okay. Now, a couple of words for Lord here, right?
King.
King. Okay. But speaking specifically of God's name, there's two words for Lord used in the Bible. Does anybody know either one of them? Yes? No?
No.
No. Okay, just checking.
I'm shaking my head. But
Adonai is the most common one. And it just means Lord or Master. Okay? The other, and this is more often rendered God, is Elohim. Now, what I want to emphasize here is this. All right, I'm going to erase King for just a second. We're going to talk about different words for God. Elohim, El Shaddai, El Elyon. Do y'all see a similarity in several of those names? Do y'all see a pattern in those names? El. Okay. Do you know where El comes from?
E?
No. Good try, though. It's actually the Canaanite word for God.
Oh.
So, at the time that the Bible begins writing about God, the Canaanites already had a word for God. It was El. So in order to differentiate the God of the Bible, they put descriptors onto El. So when you have Elohim, it's God, and in specifically, Elohim is the plural of God. So he is all gods. All gods made one, the first idea of monotheism. Okay? Second of all, El Shaddai is God Almighty. Now, why is that special? What does almighty mean?
The one with the power.
The one with the power, above all others, right? Or El Elyon, God most high. What were the Old Testament writers trying to distinguish about God from everything else?
He's all powerful.
He's all powerful. He is above all others. The God above all gods, right? So, here's my question. Be careful how you answer this question because there's a lot of baggage here. Was God the first God?
Yes.
May I ask a question here?
Sure.
When we're talking about gods in this situation,
Mm-hmm.
when you ask that question,
Mm-hmm.
are you considering them the same kind of thing? Because other gods are just figments of our imagination or an object that we place.
So, yes and no. Well, I'll get to that in just a second, okay? So, in the first sense, is God the first God? Yes, because God is the creator of all things, right? Okay? So, is God the first God? Yes. However, the word for God existed before Abraham has his conversation with God, right? Which is why we have the Canaanite word for God being used. So, it's taking God and giving a descriptor to distinguish the God from other gods. Now, in response to your question about whether there are other gods, here's my question. Are there other beings in the spiritual realm besides God?
Yes.
That's clearly true, right? Do any of them act in an evil way?
Yes.
Would that make them in some sense not like God per se, but gods in the eyes of people?
Yes.
Okay, so in the idea that gods existed in the Old Testament, obviously God's not the only actor in the spiritual realm. There are evil people in the spiritual realm, or evil beings. And so in that sense, there is a God-like factor there, right? However, who stands in control of all those things?
God.
God, right? So in the case of Saul, for example, I'm riffing a little bit here. This is not part of today's lesson, but it is important to understand. In the case of Saul, where God says, I'm going to allow an evil spirit to enter his life. It's God permitting a negative force in the spiritual realm to act on Saul. Or Job would be the earliest example that I can come up with off the top. Well, I guess you could use the serpent, but the serpent's a physical being. But in the case of Job, who starts out as the accuser in that story?
Satan.
Job 1, Satan. God allows Satan to act on Job. So in that sense, we have a spiritual being. Now, that doesn't necessarily make it a God, no, but it is a spiritual force that people can and do worship or pursue. Okay? So, in response to your question, I would make the case that there are other gods in the spiritual realm, at least in the time of the Bible, that do exist and do have power and authority. That power and authority always being subject to God. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Now, going back to this. The reason I bring this up is that there was a distinction made by the people of the Old Testament about God. It's not because God was discovered after these other gods, but it's because at the time that they began to refer to God, the people around them already had words for God. So within their language, they had to distinguish who God was. Now, there's plenty of false gods at this time too. The most common one was Baal, right? Over here somewhere. I guess over here next to false gods, I'll write Baal. Or, this is one rendering that you're going to find in your Bible. A lot of times they remove the hyphen. That's how you get the word Baal, by the way. Okay? Transliterated, it would be Baal, but that doesn't come out real well. We'd have a hard time saying it, so it's Baal in most of your Bibles. Okay? Baal was a local god, so they would have Baal of any particular city. So when they described their gods, they just said, same God, but the one that's for this city, right? As opposed to saying, this God who is most high, almighty, plural of gods, and so on, okay? Or using a different word altogether and just calling him Lord. However, people also called, like King David, Lord, Adonai. So acting as though Adonai exclusively refers to God is a bit of a misnomer. Okay? Now, this is why this is important. We talk about these different words that mean God. We talk about the way that God pre-existed other gods, but in the context of language, God is described differently. Today, when you say God, what do people assume you to mean? What God do people associate with the word God?
Our God?
The Judeo-Christian God. That's pretty simple. When people talk about God, whether they agree with him or disagree with him, it's pretty clear which God we're talking about. In that context, the term God has at least been transformed to mean we don't have to say God Most High, God of Heaven, the Christian God, because when we say God, at least in this country, people know who we're talking about. And in almost every other case, people have another name for their God. Right? So, this is why this is important. The purpose of the Old Testament, what is it?
To help us learn
To help us learn what?
how God works.
How God works, so it tells us about the character of God. Sure. What else? Why does the Old Testament exist? Why do we study it? Why does it matter?
So that we don't make the same mistakes.
Okay, so we can learn from the mistakes. That's going to be more like Romans 15. Okay. These things are written for our learning, that we by patience and comfort of the scripture, perseverance and comfort of the scriptures might have hope. Okay.
There were prophecies that come true in the New Testament that we know about.
We get to see fulfillment of those prophecies in the Old Testament. Sure. But at the very beginning, Genesis, we learn where we come from, some about who God is. But in Genesis chapter 12, something particular happens. What happens in Genesis 12? Starts with a guy whose name starts with an A. Abram. What was bad? What's special about him?
He becomes the father.
He becomes the father. So there's a certain, what we call dispensations, or an age. Patriarchs. Abraham eventually becomes the father of who?
Isaac.
Isaac, Jacob, but what nation? Israel. Now, through the course of time, Israel gets a different leader, different covenant. In Exodus, who is their leader? Moses. Moses in chapter 20 gets this set of rules called the Ten Commandments, and that begins what's called the Mosaic age. Okay? There's a reason that this is important. I will tie this all up in just a second, I promise. Okay? Purpose of the Old Testament is history of the Jewish people, even predating their specific covenant with God. It takes them all the way back to the beginning. Okay? That's number one. So you get the history of the Jewish people. Number two, the Old Testament establishes the patriarchal and Mosaic ages. Without those, you cannot get to where we are now. What age do we live in from a spiritual standpoint? Christian. Gunnar wanted to say it. He was just real shy about it.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. I could see him going, but he didn't want to say it. He was scared he'd be wrong. For the Christian, the Old Testament acts as a tutor or teacher to bring us to Christ. That's Galatians chapter 3, verses 22 through 25. That's what Paul says the Old Testament is for the Christian. This is important because all three of these are at least set up in the Old Testament. They are the forerunner to where we are today. Now, the Mosaic age is very, very clear, right? It has several books explaining in brutal detail every aspect of Jewish law. But what about the patriarchal age? What does God, by what standard is Noah found righteous? Or Job? Or Abram? How are they found righteous?
Natural law?
Natural law we would guess, but we don't get a lot of explanation about how the patriarchal law worked, do we? We know that Cain and Abel, for example, offered sacrifices and God liked Abel's and didn't like Cain's. But we're not really sure why. We guess it has to do with the animals versus the vegetables, or maybe it has something to do with the heart of the man that offered it and all this stuff, right? Like we guess as to what happened, but we don't really know for certain, right? Oh, look who came. Yeah. This is why this is important. There is a ton of vagueness in the patriarchal age. Which is why, bless you, most of the Hebrew words for God piggyback off the Canaanite words. They're vague. It's God carving out his place among his people. Abraham is selected because he lives righteously. Abraham's going to approach God with the language that he understands. But we don't get a lot of details about how or why. Which is why when you get to the Jews, we have the name Jehovah referred to as Yahweh because they thought God's name was too holy to speak. So it's written out Jehovah, but when it's spoken just the vowel sounds, Yahweh. It's not something that ought to be said. Okay? So the Jews begin forming their own words because they have a more detailed covenant. They have a law that they feel like God's name is so holy it can't be spoken. Abraham, Noah, Job didn't have that concept. Okay? We see the progression of God and the way his people approach him as he singles the people out. By comparison, the people around Israel also formed their own gods. They found gods to approach, and in some cases they approached the one true God. Romans teaches us that there were people outside of Israel that approached God basically by accident. They were convicted by their conscience. They acted righteously even apart from God, and they were justified by this. Okay? That's going to be Romans chapter 2, verses 12 through 16. Paul talking about the righteous outside of Judaism. Let's go ahead and turn to Romans chapter 2. I want us to read that part.
To what?
Verse 12. And we'll start over here with you, Derek. Romans 2, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Go ahead, whenever you're ready. Romans 2:12.
All who sin apart from the law will also perish apart from the law. And all who sin under the law will be judged by the law.
Okay, so we have the law and not the law. We're in the Mosaic age is what he's talking about because Paul's writing to Roman converts and Jewish converts in Rome. So people that have a Jewish background and people that don't. He's trying to tell them that there's no difference between you anymore. And so he talks about how those who sinned outside the law, it wasn't like sin didn't count for non-Jews. Still sin. Okay? They'll be judged or perish under the law. And then those that sinned under the law or outside the law, treatment's the same. Right? Lane, next verse, 13.
For it is not those who hear the law who are righteous in God's sight, but those who obey the law and will be declared righteous.
Okay, so under the Mosaic age, it was possible to obey the law not having heard it. Okay? Gunnar?
For when Gentiles who do not have the law, by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law.
Okay, and that's kind of like what you were talking about just a second ago. Natural law, right? Megan?
They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts. Their consciences also bear witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times even defending them.
Okay. Edie?
This will take place on the day when God judges people's secrets through Jesus Christ, as my gospel declares.
Okay. The whole purpose of explaining this is to say that there were righteous people under the Jewish system and outside of it. If we were to draw a timeline, and I'm rapidly running out of space, but I'll try right down here. Patriarchal age was the first age that existed. Cain and Abel, Noah were all righteous before even the call of Abraham. They were righteous by some standard. Even the Hebrew writer in Hebrews chapter 11 tells us that those people were righteous, right? So that age exists. The Mosaic age comes in Exodus chapter 20 when the law is given, and the people now have a standard by which they're found righteous. Now the question is, does this law stop when the Mosaic age comes in? Romans chapter 2 tells us no, because there are still righteous people outside of Judaism. That's what Paul writes in Romans 2. So it's important to understand there is still a righteousness standard outside of Judaism, even while the Jews exist. But eventually, with the death of Christ, what happens? Well, we have the beginning of the Christian dispensation. And what will eventually take place? In order to answer this question, I need to go to Acts chapter 17. Acts 17, and we're going to read a big chunk of Acts 17. We're going to start in verse 22. Kaya, you'll be first in London. Acts 17,
Verse?
22.
So Paul, standing in the midst of the
Areopagus.
said, Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious.
For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription: To the unknown God, what therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you.
Pause here. All right, he's talking to a room full of pagans, right? I see that you're very religious. You have all of these gods. You even have an unknown God. So, this one that you worship without knowing is who I'm going to talk about. Now, here's the question. He's talking about an idol, right? An inscription before an idol. Is that God? No. We can all agree about that, right? But Paul says, I'm going to talk to you about the God that you don't know. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes.
Obviously. You have all these gods. So let me talk to you about the one you don't know. Because if you knew him, you wouldn't have all these others. All right? It's Paul approaching them where they are, right? All right, so just so we're clear, he's not talking about that idol. He uses that as a wedge to get in to talk about the one true God. Next verse.
The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by human hands.
25.
Nor is he worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, since he gives to all life, breath, and all things.
All right, in those two statements, has he ruled out that he's talking about that God?
Yes.
Pretty much. He doesn't dwell in temples. He's not anything made out of human hands. He does not need anything from you. So he has ruled out this idol. He's still talking about the God they don't know, but he's ruled out that one. Okay, Susan, next verse.
And he made from one every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation.
Okay, what is he saying about this God?
He is the God?
He's the God. Okay, well, he's going back and he's pulling out these kind of ideas, right? God above all other gods. God most high. Okay? Verse 27. Dare?
God did this so they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us.
Okay, now he's talking about God made everything so that people would try to seek him. Well, who did?
These people?
These people. Is he talking about the Jews in this passage?
No.
No. He is specifically talking to pagans, and he's talking about historical people outside Judaism. As a matter of fact, he is predating Judaism because he said this God created everything. Where did he go back to?
Creation.
Creation. Again, this is one of the things I can't hammer enough. In the New Testament, whether they're talking to Jews or pagans, the first century evangelists always went back before Jewish law. They talked about the beginning. Jesus is asked about marriage, he goes back to the creation of man and woman. Jesus is asked about death, he goes back to the point about man and woman. Okay? Paul, when talking about paganism, went back to creation. They keep going back before Jewish law. It's not that Jewish law isn't important, but it's the point at which everyone was judged by the same standard. It's the point at which you didn't have to be a Jew to approach God. Anyone could. And so you had people like Cain and Abel, and Noah, and Job, and even Abraham justified by some standard that we don't even understand or know. But because God created this in hopes that people would, what does it say there? In hopes that people would approach him. Does anybody have another word there in verse 27? In hopes that they might
Reach out for him.
seek, reach out. I have groped.
Feel their way.
What does that mean?
Reach for desperately?
Yeah, they're just reaching out. They're trying to catch a hold of something. I want you to think about, have you ever walked through your house when it's dark? Right? Do you do tow radar when you walk through the house and it's dark? Where you go? Just to make sure you don't trip over something. Anybody else do tow radar? I do. Okay? Or maybe you do this thing. That's groping. Okay? That's looking for something to make sure I can not run into it. Well, in this case, he says they're looking for something in the dark. Has anybody ever played flashlight tag? Nobody? Was that just a thing when I was a kid? All right, you go out in the middle of the night, everybody gets one flashlight and you play tag. It's a great way to get hurt. All right? Because if you run through something that your flashlight's not pointing at, I mean, I've seen dudes like run straight into a barbed wire fence. Like, I've seen bad things happen, okay? But it's important to understand, because if you're a good hider, you don't use the flashlight. And people have to try to tag you without knowing where you're at. That's groping for something, okay? That was a huge deal when I was in high school. Like, we played it all the time. All right, this is important, though. God created everything, put mankind in place in hopes that they might reach out to him. Did people find God?
Yes.
Sure. We have records of it. Are there plenty of people that reach out and found something else?
Yes.
Absolutely. So, some people reached in the dark and thought they had a hold of the lamp, but it wasn't. Or thought they had a hold of the couch, but it wasn't. And so some people reached out in an effort to find God and found something else, and that became the object of their worship. This is how paganism came to be. But what Paul is saying is that some of you reached out and found God and didn't even know you found God. You obeyed a law that was written on your hearts. You went, this just seems right, and that just seems wrong, and you were correct. Okay? Who's my last reader? You were 27, 28?
For in him we live and move and have our being, as some of your poets have said, we are his offspring.
Okay, so he says even your poets, your pagan ideals have said we're the offspring of gods. Okay? Your poets have figured out that you're the offspring of gods. I'm just telling you which God you are truly the offspring of. Even you guys have found by accident who God is. I'm just pointing out who God really is. Okay? We live and move and have being inside of God so that when you reach out, he's actually nearby. Just some of you miss him. You reach out and grab something else. We'll get to that in just a second. Gunnar, next verse, 29.
Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man.
So instead of creating something to grab onto, we ought to understand that we dwell inside of God. Not that God dwells inside of us necessarily, or that we can create something to create God. Megan, next verse.
In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent.
Okay, so Paul's telling them you've been justified by just living right apart from God, even though you did not know. What does the word ignorance mean? Is it the same thing as stupid? No, it's different. What was
Not
your...
knowledgeable?
Not knowledgeable. Unknown. So when Paul says this ignorance God wants to overlook, God used to be okay with the fact that you reached out in the dark and found him and didn't know what you had a hold of. But God is not okay with that anymore. There is no more righteousness just by reaching out and accidentally grabbing God. Okay? What does that put an end to on this timeline?
The top.
Patriarchal.
The patriarchal age. That's gone. Because no more can you reach out and grab God by accident. Okay, let's keep reading. Next verse. Megan, were you last? So eating?
For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead.
All right, who is he talking about in that verse?
Christ.
Jesus, or Christ. Now, we know because of other writings that Christ's death nailed the old law to the cross. That's also in Romans. We'd have to go back there. I don't want to spend a bunch of time beating that to death. But if we're being judged by the words of Christ, what did Christ fulfill or bring an end to?
Mosaic.
The Mosaic. Good job.
I can
Which
speak.
means that the only standard left is this. Christian. Okay? Now, this is important for us to understand because it's the idea that people reached out and found God through the law of Moses, and they were justified by it. People reached out and found God apart from the law of Moses, but they were right and were justified by it. But that's not okay anymore. So there is a point at which pursuing a God we don't know is no longer acceptable. You got to know him. You got to come to know him. Okay? That's why God sent his son, is so that we could know him. So, now we have to talk about where these false gods come from. Because I said, they're reaching in the dark. Mankind is reaching in the dark, trying to find God, and they lay hold of something. What is it they're laying hold of? Sometimes it was God. Sometimes it was not. And it had a lot to do with what they were trying to find in the dark. Okay? So here's what we're going to talk about. I need people to go to Exodus 32. The idea that people could reach for God, not even know him, and have the right God proves that there were some people who were, by the Jewish definition, worshiping a false God because they were not Jews. They were not keeping the Mosaic law. But Paul says they were justified by their conscience. They were justified by living the law even though they didn't know it. But there were also people inside and outside of Judaism that reached out in the dark, grabbed the wrong thing, believed in it, and they were wrong regardless of whether they were Jews or not. So you couldn't just pursue anything you wanted. You had to find the right thing even if it was by accident. Exodus 32. What do we have in Exodus 32? Who's got bold headings?
Golden calf.
The golden calf. Now, most of you know this story, right? What happened? Aaron? Okay, keep going. Yes, he is in the story. He does turn up.
Moses goes on the mountain.
Moses is on the mountain. What's Moses on the mountain doing?
Talking to God.
Talking to God to get the 10 Commandments, right? Starts in chapter 20. So for 11 chapters, Moses has been on the mountain. Okay? Has the Mosaic age begun yet?
No.
No, because there's no law yet. Okay? We're still in the patriarchal dispensation. People are still reaching in the dark. Okay? What did these people find? They reached out in the dark, found 2 golden calves. And Aaron's going to talk very similar to that when he's asked, what did you do? And he says, I threw this gold in the fire and these calves jumped out. Right? That's Aaron going, I reached in the dark. As a matter of fact, I threw it in fire and it just came out. As if he had no part in it, right? This calf jumped out. And that's Aaron leaning back to the way things used to be, right? Here's what happens. Verse 32, or chapter 32, verse 1. Who's my next reader? Okay, chapter 32, verse 1.
When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain.
Pause. We're going to set the scene first, then we'll talk about what happened. What happened in this story? Moses delayed. He took a while, right? So these people, right, who saw plagues in Egypt, who saw the Red Sea parted and swallow their enemies behind them, who saw a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night, and even a pillar of fire that stood behind them and defended them from the Egyptians catching them, all this. They've seen all of this, and they got bored. Because after all that happened, which, by the way, we learned later in Exodus that there was smoke and thunder and earthquakes, and so that the people were scared to even go near the foot of the mountain. So they got further away from the mountain and said, Moses, why don't you just go up instead and just come back and tell us what God said? All right? The presence of God on Sinai was so overwhelming that people had to get away from it. But while they got away from it, they got bored. They got distracted. So what did they do? Well, okay. Moses delayed coming down from the mountain. Kaya, pick up again.
The people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, Up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him.
Okay, why did they go to Aaron?
Who was Moses' brother?
He was Moses' brother. He was Moses' right-hand man. He was Moses' mouth, right? He did all the talking for Moses because Moses said, I can't speak good. And God said, I'll let your brother do the talking for you, right? You tell him what to say, he'll say it. Okay. So they went to Aaron because they could identify him. They went out and said, all right, this is something that we can see and touch. We're going to grab a hold of this guy. Okay. And we don't know what happened to Moses, but what do they say about Moses? As for this Moses, what did it say, Kaya?
The man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt.
Wait a minute. Who brought them out of Egypt?
Not
God.
Not Moses. God. Okay? But these people reached out in the dark and went, here's the guy that brought us out of Egypt. And we don't know what happened to him. Okay? We need something else we can lay hold of. So, let's grab his brother. Come here, Aaron. Aaron, we need gods. All right? Your brother apparently had a god that could do all these cool things, but we don't know what happened to him. So we need you to make another one. Okay? That was their logic. Moses made up a god. His god was good. Now he's gone. What happened to his god? Aaron, we need a backup god in a hurry. Okay, it's like the starting quarterback got injured. Quick, get the backup warmed up. Because who knows what could happen from here, right? So they got bored, they got distracted, they reached out in the dark and grabbed the wrong thing. Verse 2, London.
So Aaron said to them, Take off your rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives, your sons and daughters, and bring them to me.
All right. Now, Aaron also turned around and reached out in the dark and went, grab all this gold. Okay? Not a great idea. We're going to skip over verse 3. They all tore out their rings. They brought them to Aaron. He received the gold from their hand. He fashioned it with an engraving tool, made a calf. Then they said, This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt. Now, they just watched this God get made, right?
Yeah.
How in the world could it be the God that brought them out of Egypt?
Because he told them.
It was not here. Like, this is a major level of recency bias. Okay? This obviously did not exist before we threw our golden rings to Aaron. But this is the God that brought us out of Egypt. Why did they come to that conclusion?
Because they're used to attributing that kind of logic.
Because they're accustomed to idols, sure. But the other thing is, they reached out in the dark and they had to get a hold of something. And they grabbed the nearest thing. here's a God. Which, by the way, Max Burnham did a great job one time explaining that this God would have been about yay big. We think like a God. No. If you did all the math, this sucker is like the size of a large dog, okay? It would not even be a life-size calf in most cases, okay? But this is your God. They reached out in the dark and grabbed a hold of the nearest thing, and what they got was a golden calf. Now, verse 6, Louisa.
So the next day the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. Afterward they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry.
Okay. Mine reads a little bit different. It says they sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Now, they created a God, and the first thing they did was do what?
Sacrifice to it.
Okay. They honored their God, and then threw a party. Okay? They got bored. They got distracted. Hey, we don't know what happened to Moses. He's taken a long time. So let's just make a new God. And then we can have a party.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know if they think he's taking a long time. I think they think he came to his demise because
It's very possible.
I think it's very possible in this day when people were probably killed more often out in the fields and we wouldn't necessarily know. So
It's very possible. So they could have thought he died.
Yeah.
But and they do say we don't know what became of him.
Yeah.
They're not saying definitively that he's dead. They just don't know that he's coming back.
I just think it was more normal in that time for someone to wander off and not come back, and the end was truly a death. So
That's fair. I mean, I can see that.
I'm not saying, I'm not justifying them. I'm just trying to put it more.
Well, and the case that I'm making is more that even if Moses had died, they didn't go to Aaron and talk to him about the God of Moses.
Right.
They went to Aaron and said, "Give us a God." And Aaron's logical conclusion was, "Well, I guess I can build one. I know how to fashion gold, right?" So, this is what's also important for us to understand, right? They formed this God, and the purpose of forming this God was, yes, so that they could have a God, but also so they could move on. Okay? They're tired of waiting for Moses to come back, even though he said he would come back. This sense of urgency that people have in this day and age is actually fairly common. I mean, in the case of Saul, the first reason that he loses his dynasty is because he just couldn't wait for Samuel. Samuel took too long to get there. He was very impatient. So the first false god that the children of Israel created, even before they were completely established, they didn't even have their law yet. The first thing that they do is they got bored and they got distracted. Why did they create a god? Well, one, because they needed one, but also so that they could play. Waiting for this God's not fun. Let's create one and then have a party for it. Okay? Easiest example I can think of is when things are going really, really poor in somebody's house, like you've got a sick family member or whatever else, and I don't know if this is as common with other people. Susan, you can vouch if it's something that y'all do. You do something fun to kind of distract the family. You know, like things are really, really rough right now. Maybe it's a great time to like go to Six Flags or do a movie night or go to Chuck E. Cheese or whatever, right? It's something to distract yourself. The children of Israel have been through a lot, all right? They've walked for days. They're in the middle of the wilderness at the foot of a mountain and their leader's gone. Let's do something fun, okay? We just need to do something fun. So they created a god for their own purposes to distract themselves so they'd have the reason to play, okay? So that's the first example. Now, while that is happening, right, Exodus 32 talks about what God says right then. But while Moses was away, go back to chapter 20. It's Exodus 20. Sorry. Starting in verse 1. Louisa, did you just read?
Yes, sir.
Susan, read 1 and 2, and I'll pick up from there.
Then God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery.
Okay. Their excuse when they started looking for a God. We need a God that can lead us, right? And when they created that golden calf, this is your God who brought you out of Egypt. That's what they wanted. They wanted a God that had brought them out of Egypt. The first thing that God says in his discussion with Moses is, I am the God who brought you out of Egypt. While he is saying that and literally writing it in stone, the children of Israel are reaching in the dark for a God that brought them out of Egypt and just grabbed the wrong one. Okay? Verse 2, you shall have no other gods before me. What does that mean? Sorry, verse 3, you shall have no other gods before me. What does that mean?
Put nothing above me.
Put nothing above me. So when it says before, you're saying it means in sequence. I can't be second place. Okay? Does anybody have another read of what the word before means?
You shall have no other God than me.
No other God than me in my presence. So, for example, let's just say that I hate this eraser. Okay, let's say I hate it. Okay? And I mean really, really hate it. Do I want it not in front of me or nowhere near me?
Nowhere near you.
Nowhere near me. Okay? So when God says have no other gods before me, and believe me, he hates false gods. Okay? He's not just saying you can't put anything in front of me. He says don't have any other gods in my presence. Don't have any other gods in my face. Okay? So it's not that he wants you to put them behind him, like, oh, you can have other gods as long as they rank second. It's have no other gods at all. Get them out of here. All right? So the first thing God says, the number one and first command, it'll become the greatest command. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, strength, mind. Right? But the initial way of saying it was, have no other gods in my presence. Where is God's presence?
Everywhere.
Everywhere. Because what did Paul say about this God? He doesn't dwell in temples made by human hands, but we live and move and have our very being in him. So if God's saying have no other gods in my presence, he's ruling out having other gods anywhere ever, period. Right? Not like, well, we can worship our God over here and their God over here, and then it's okay. Right? So God's ruling all of that out in verse 3. Verse 4. You shall not. Oh, wait. We already broke the first one because we reached out for a God and grabbed the wrong one. But the next thing was, you shall not make for yourselves a carved image, any likeness of anything that is on heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. All right. So he's pretty well ruled out making gods out of creatures, but also even making gods in the spiritual realm besides him. No carved image, including him. Right? Okay. You shall not bow down to them nor serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands to those who love me and keep my commands. All right? So, don't make any other gods. Period. I am a jealous God. Not only will I not be second place, I won't even be first place in a multi-God race. Okay? So he's ruling out polytheism entirely. Just me, only ever. Verse 7, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. What does that mean?
Don't say it carelessly.
Don't say it carelessly. Okay, that's one thing, sure. But when it talks about taking God's name in vain, what does vain mean?
Inappropriately?
Inappropriately, kind of.
Useless.
Useless. Don't make it meaningless. Do not rob it of its meaning. So when we talk about God, God's name has to have the meaning that he requires. Okay? Which is why when in the Old Testament, when Solomon writes about things being vanity of vanities, all is vanity. That's Ecclesiastes. That's the recurring phrase. Your Bible, a lot of you, is going to render that meaningless, everything is meaningless. It has no meaning. It is pointless. But we look at take God's name in vain and go, well, what he's really saying is you can't hyphenate God's name with anything else, right? And so anytime you add God's name to a dirty word or you swear using God's name, that's taking God's name in vain. Sure, that's removing the meaning of God's name, but that's not the only thing that removes the meaning of God's name. Taking God's name and ascribing it to something that's not God is also vainly using God's name. Every false god claiming to be a god is vanity in the sight of God. Pointlessness. You saying that this thing is our God is misusing my name because I am not that thing. Every false god is using God's name in vain, which is why it comes right after the instruction not to have idols. Not only can you not do that, you can't even ascribe my name to a formless thing. If you say that I am anything but who I am, you're misusing my name. Which is why when people say, well, God says blank, and it's not something that God says, they're vainly using God's name. Y'all understand? The vanity of using God's name is taking the true meaning away, taking the honor away from it, taking the purpose away from it. That is vainly using God's name. Now, if my watch is right, we're out of time for today. So what we're going to do is pick up on this class next week. I don't think it'll take the full time, but we're going to pick up from this right here and talk about how people reached out in the darkness and grabbed the wrong thing. That is where false gods come from. And the first example is in Exodus 32, where people reached out in the dark looking for God, who had led them out of Egypt. That's what they claimed they had found when they grabbed this golden calf. But in reality, they found what they wanted to find. They found the kind of God that fit what they needed. We need a reason to play. We need a reason to have a feast. Okay? So, next week we'll pick up from there. Questions or comments before we close today? Yes?
Why isn't it bad then to call a false god by that same name that we call God? Why is it okay to use the word God for both of them?
Okay, so one of it has to do with whether God's a proper name or an improper name.
Okay.
So, for example, I'll show you my notes sometime. When I talk about gods, plural, lowercase the g. It's not a name. Okay? It has to do with what is the proper name for God. And in our language, we just call him God or Father. Right? But when I say that my dad is my father, it's obviously I'm not calling him my God. Right? There's a distinction that you have to be careful in the way you use it. In Old Testament times, they actually had appropriate, proper names. Like, again, this was the name of God, and it was so important that they wrote it in such a way it couldn't be spoken. Right? So they referred to God as God Most High, or God Almighty, or the God of Heaven. Okay? We have shortened that to just say, capital G God is God the Father. Okay? And when we say God, generally in a colloquial sense, we know what we're talking about. And when we say gods as in plural, like the Egyptian God or whatever, nobody thinks we're talking about God Most High, right? It has more to do with how we use the name in vernacular, but it also has to do with the limitations of our language. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Which is why, if you hear people that are not Christian refer to God, they generally try to categorize him, the Judeo-Christian God, or the God of the Bible, or what have you. Whereas we just say God, and we use the descriptors to describe the false gods.
Mm-hmm.
Like if I'm talking about Greek gods, I'm going to be like Greek gods. And you know I'm not talking about real gods, right?
Yes.
Does that understand? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Follow. Any follow-ups besides that? Awesome. Thank y'all for listening. We'll pick up here next week, okay?